Jada and Janelle Rivers enrolled at one of the most prestigious and overwhelmingly white private schools in the state. They were prepared for challenges, but nothing could have braced them for the reality that greeted them the moment they walked through those gleaming iron gates. From day one, the atmosphere was clear. This place wasn't built with them in mind. Ryan Mallory and his group of well-dressed tormentors had made up their minds before the first bell even rang. For them, the Rivers sisters were outsiders, and they were going to be reminded of that every single day. The twins were met with offhand comments, deliberate bumps in the hallway, and cruel stares in the cafeteria, but things escalated fast. It wasn't just snide remarks or whispering anymore, it was physical, and that's when the bullies made their first real mistake. What they didn't know, what they never thought to consider, was that Jada and Janelle were not only mentally prepared for this, but physically trained. Their father, Derek Rivers, had raised them with the understanding that strength isn't about aggression. It's about readiness, about knowing who you are even when the world tells you to shrink. He didn't just teach them how to speak up. He taught them discipline, precision, and confidence through years of martial arts. These girls were black belts, and more importantly, they never bowed to hatred. The morning sun stretched across the carefully manicured lawns of Rosewood Hills Academy, casting long golden streaks across brick walls and trimmed hedges. Everything about the campus looked like a brochure, polished, historic, untouchable. It was a place soaked in tradition, the kind where the hallways echoed with quiet rules no one had to say out loud, and from the first moment, the Rivers sisters felt them all pressing down like invisible weight on their shoulders. Their uniforms were immaculate, their steps perfectly in sync, their expressions calm, controlled. But beneath that poised surface, they could feel it. The stares, the whispers, the judgment in every glance. This wasn't ordinary curiosity. This was different, sharper, colder. A silent message delivered with a smirk or a turned back. You don't belong here. It wasn't just about being new, and it wasn't just about being twins. It was about being them, two proud black girls entering a world that had already decided who they were before they ever said a word. Their father had prepared them for this. He didn't sugarcoat the world. He taught them to stand tall, to walk with self-respect, and to never let someone else define their worth. He also taught them how to protect themselves with calm, with clarity, and, if necessary, with action. They hadn't even reached the main doors when a voice sliced through the morning like a dull blade. "Look at that!" A boy sneered loudly enough to make sure they heard him. Leaning against a pillar with the confidence of someone who's never been told no, Ryan smirked as his friends chuckled. "Twins?" one added mockingly. "Didn't know they made them in matching sets." Jada's gaze flicked toward them. She saw the way they stood, puffed up like peacocks, feeding off each other's arrogance. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't speak. Her father's voice echoed in her head. "They want a reaction. Don't give it to them." Janelle's grip on her backpack strap turned her knuckles pale, but her face didn't flinch. They didn't need to speak. They'd been through too much together. Their bond ran deeper than words, forged in childhood, sharpened through every challenge. And right now, it kept them focused. Without breaking stride, they walked forward, not with defiance, but with purpose. They felt the stairs burn like a magnifying glass aimed at their backs. The courtyard around them, with its cobblestone paths and ivy-covered walls, wasn't just a school ground, it was a test. One they had no intention of failing. Inside, the silence was different, colder. The air conditioning hummed, but it couldn't freeze the fire building beneath their calm surfaces. Students in the hallway paused. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Eyes followed them, some openly curious, others openly hostile, and a few wore something worse. Quiet smirks that said, "Let's see how long they last." Jada's eyes scanned the hallway like a soldier reading a battlefield. She noted everything. The boys clustering by the lockers like a pack, the girls whispering behind manicured nails, glancing sideways with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Every gesture, every sideways glance, every sign of territory claimed and lines drawn. Janelle's voice came low, steady, almost like a thought. Ignore them. She didn't even need to look at her sister. She already knew Jada was seeing it all. I see them, Jada whispered back, calm but cutting. I'm just not giving them what they want. As the heavy doors closed behind them, the message was clear. This school may not have been made for them. But that didn't mean they didn't belong. It felt like a challenge written in the air, the kind that doesn't shout but lingers in silence, daring you to react. Jada and Janelle could feel it in every glance, every smirk, every whisper spoken just loud enough to sting, yet soft enough to deny if called out. They knew this wasn't the peak, it was only the beginning. A quiet buildup, a rising pressure that would grow until it became impossible to ignore. But they were ready. They had weathered worse. They were trained not only in self-defense, but in self-control. And although the sky over Rosewood Hills Academy was clear, they could sense a storm hovering beyond the horizon. They wouldn't be the ones to start it. Their father had drilled that lesson into them. But if the storm came for them, they wouldn't run. They would meet it with more strength than anyone expected. Those first days at Rosewood Hills were exactly what they had braced for, but that didn't make them any easier to endure. From the moment they stepped into their first class, it was obvious. Every eye was watching, but not with welcome, not with curiosity, with judgment, quiet, cold, unspoken judgment. The classroom was spotless. Sunlight danced off desks and polished floors, but no shine could cover how unwelcome they were made to feel. Teachers said their names without looking up, their voices flat, dismissive. Like Jada and Janelle were just part of the attendance list. Not students, not people, not worth a moment more. In the hallways, it was worse. The crowd shifted just enough to force the twins to slow down or step aside, all under the illusion of coincidence. But it wasn't. Everyone knew it, and yet no one said it. Jada and Janelle didn't let it show. They kept their chins up. They walked with purpose. They moved through it like stone through water. But the pressure was constant. And then came Ryan Mallory. He wasn't hard to spot. His walk said everything. Confidence without caution, arrogance without limits. He looked like he lived in a world that had always said yes to him. Blonde hair sculpted to perfection, uniform worn with just enough rebellion to signal that rules didn't apply to him. "Hey!" Ryan called across the courtyard one morning, his voice booming like he owned the school. Jada and Janelle were heading to their lockers. His friends were already laughing, not at something funny, but at what they knew was coming. "You two get lost on your way to the servants' entrance?" His voice was laced with cruelty, dressed as humor. His crew cracked up, loud and over the top, not because it was clever, but because it hurt. Janelle didn't react. Her face was a calm mask. Her stride didn't change. Jada gave him a single look, sharp, focused, and then moved on. She saw the smirk on his face, saw how his friends elbowed each other with glee, and though her chest was tight with rage, she locked it away. Just like they'd practiced. But Ryan wasn't done. "Guess they don't speak English," he added, louder this time, eyes scanning the growing group of students now watching. "Maybe we should try their language." "What is it, jungle talk?" This time the laughter rippled out wider. Students who had been minding their own business moments earlier now stopped to stare. Some looked away quickly. Most didn't. Most just watched. Some even smiled. Jada clenched her jaw, took a slow breath. Janelle was beside her, a steady presence, like a shield, like a signal. They walked on, and it only got worse. Ryan's friends, Zach and Brent, started to escalate things. It became a game to them. They bumped into the twins, by accident, knocking books from their hands. Then came the fake apologies, the smug expressions, the whispered comments. "Didn't know they let janitors take classes," Zach muttered one afternoon as he shoved past Jada, his voice aimed just right to make sure others heard. "Maybe they're just here to practice," Brent added, grinning. "Somebody's got to keep the floors clean." The twins said nothing. They picked up their books. They stood tall, and they kept walking. But with every shove, every comment, the pressure around them grew heavier, like invisible weights added to their shoulders, one insult at a time. And what made it worse was the silence from everyone else. No one stepped in. No one challenged it. Teachers kept their eyes on their screens. Students averted their gaze. The school pretended to be perfect, but perfection has cracks, and Jada and Janelle were being shoved right into them. At home, their father saw it. Even though his daughters tried to hide the stress behind tight smiles and casual words, he noticed the way they moved, the exhaustion in their voices, the tension in their eyes. Derek Rivers had taught them to fight, not just with their hands, but with awareness. He had taught them how to read danger before it exploded. At dinner, he watched them carefully. He didn't ask, he didn't push, he waited. And when the words finally came, he listened, all the way through. "You remember what I taught you?" he asked that night, his voice steady and low. "Control is power. They want you to break. Don't let them. Never give them what they came for." Jada nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a firm line. Janelle matched her expression. They weren't giving up. They were just getting started. Determination burned behind their calm eyes, though a flicker of frustration began to show. A frustration that was getting harder to hide with every passing day. "They're pushing," Jada said one evening, her voice low but firm. "Every day, a little harder," Derek replied without missing a beat. "They think you'll break. They want you to." "And if they don't stop?" Janelle asked, steady as ever, though the meaning in her words was sharp. Their father looked at them both, his gaze clear, unwavering. There was no doubt in his voice when he answered, "Then they'll learn. You're not the ones who break." His words didn't need drama or volume. They carried weight in silence, the kind of weight the twins carried into the next day and every day that followed, quiet but powerful, like armor beneath their school uniforms. They walked through the halls of Rosewood Hills with poise, with purpose, not because they believed things would get better on their own, but because they were prepared for when they didn't. It was no longer a question of if things would escalate. It was only when. And that moment, it was approaching fast. Each day blurred into the next, colder and more exhausting than the one before. It was like the school itself. The shining floors, the tall windows, the carefully curated calm was slowly pressing in around them. Not loud, not sudden, but relentless, as if it had been designed to test how much discomfort they could carry before something inside them finally gave out. They had made it through the stairs, through the whispers, through the casual cruelty disguised as jokes in the lunch line. They'd endured the giggles in the locker room, the bumping shoulders in the hallway, the way students laughed louder when teachers were near, because they knew no one would stop them. This school didn't punish cruelty, it rewarded silence. And silence had become the loudest sound of all. But the pressure wasn't building by accident. Ryan Mallory had been watching, closely. He saw how they carried themselves, how they refused to react. And instead of being discouraged, he got excited. Because Ryan wasn't looking to insult, he was looking to break, to get a reaction that would finally confirm what he already believed, that power belonged to him. So he planned something worse, something not just petty, but public. It happened on a Tuesday. The moment Jada and Janelle approached their lockers, they stopped cold. Red paint, thick, smeared, and deliberate, was scrawled across the metal doors in giant letters. Hate-filled slurs sprayed boldly, shamelessly, where everyone could see. Drawings, grotesque, cartoonish, meant to mock, covered every inch. Crumpled papers had been shoved through the vents, each one filled with more insults, more poison. A contest of cruelty, like a group of them had spent the night trying to outdo each other in filth. The hallway erupted. Laughter, phones out, snapping photos, recording, sharing. Some students laughed openly, doubling over as if this were a comedy show. Others covered their mouths, pretending to be shocked, but not enough to walk away. No one stopped it, no one spoke up, and at the center of it all stood Ryan, leaning against a nearby locker, arms folded, smug grin wide. Zach and Brent flanked him like proud soldiers watching their masterpiece unfold. Every line of their bodies screamed satisfaction. "Figured we'd give you some decorations," Ryan called out, his voice loud, fake friendly. "Thought it might help you feel more at home." More laughter, more phones, more noise crashing through the hallway like a wave of mockery. Even a teacher passing by paused, just for a second, looked at the lockers, at the crowd, at the twins, then kept walking, eyes down, pretending not to see. Janelle's hands curled into fists, nails pressing into her palms, her breath tight in her chest. Rage burned behind her eyes. She could feel her sister beside her, and she knew, without a word, Jada was holding back the same storm. They had been insulted, they had been shoved, but this wasn't just personal. This was a performance, a statement staged for everyone to witness, a deliberate act to strip away their dignity. And it stung. No matter how calm they looked, it stung. But then, Derek's voice, calm, controlled, repeating in their minds like a shield. Control is power. They want to shake you. Don't give them the reward. And still, it got worse. Ryan stepped forward, slow and theatrical, clapping with exaggerated flair. His voice dropped lower, but every word landed like a slap. "You should say thank you," he sneered, standing close now. "Takes effort to make you two feel like you belong here." Silence. All eyes were locked on them. Students, phones, whispers waiting for a slip, a tremble, a tear, anything. Jada stared straight at Ryan, unblinking, cold. Her message was clear even without words. You don't win here. Janelle didn't move, but the heat rising inside her was undeniable. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself, her heart pounding like a drum in her ears. And yet, neither spoke. Not yet. But the line was wearing thin, and everyone in that hallway could feel it. Jada steadied herself against the wave of fury threatening to rise up inside her. She wouldn't give Ryan the reaction he wanted. Not yet. But they both knew, without a word between them, that something had shifted. A line had been crossed, and it wasn't just about locker graffiti or whispered insults anymore. This wasn't a bad day. It was a moment that cut deep, one they couldn't ignore, couldn't let slide. As they stood there wiping red paint from their lockers, the paper towels rough and already soaked, handed silently by a janitor who wouldn't meet their eyes, the hallway buzzed with distant murmurs. The crowd had moved on, but the damage lingered, and then finally, Jada broke the silence between them. "No more," she said, her voice quiet but solid, like steel buried under calm. Janelle didn't need her to explain. She felt it too. The crack in the wall of patience they had built, the last thread of silence stretching too thin to hold. She nodded once, sharp and certain. "No more," she repeated. This wasn't a decision born from anger alone. It came from something deeper, the understanding that surviving was no longer enough, that if they kept turning away, if they kept swallowing their pride in silence, they'd lose a part of themselves they'd never get back. They didn't go looking for a fight, but if it came, they wouldn't walk away. The air at Rosewood Hills hadn't softened since the attack. If anything, it had grown thicker, charged, expectant. Students talked quieter now. They watched longer. They lingered near places they never used to, as if they all sensed the storm gathering and were waiting for lightning to strike. And Jada and Janelle, they walked that storm like it was a hallway, heads high, steps steady, every sense sharpened. At the edge of the courtyard, Ryan waited. Leaning against the sun-warmed stone, the picture of confidence soaked in cruelty. Zach and Brent stood with him, relaxed on the surface, but alert underneath, the way predators look when prey is near. Ryan wore his usual smirk, but this time, there was something extra in it. Like he believed this wasn't a confrontation, just a conclusion. "There they are," Ryan called out, voice raised for effect. The students nearby turned quickly. Some laughed, some whispered. Others just watched, their attention drawn like moths to flame. "Thought maybe you two would take the hint and stay home," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Jada didn't stop walking. She didn't flinch. Her gaze found his with perfect clarity, eyes locked like a spotlight. "If that's what you were hoping," she said calmly, voice as clean as glass, "then you're even more pathetic than I thought." Gasps rippled across the courtyard like wind. The crowd stirred, surprised, unsure, suddenly alert. Ryan's smirk faltered, just slightly, but it was enough to see the flash of heat behind his eyes. "You've got a lot of nerve," he spat, stepping away from the wall. He walked forward with that false swagger of someone who'd never once been challenged. "Talking like that, acting like you belong here." Janelle shifted beside her sister, shoulders back, feet planted. Her voice came out clear and steady, every word a response to every insult, every shove, every time she had to pretend it didn't sting. "We do belong here," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "More than you ever will." That struck deeper than he expected. His posture twitched. The students around them leaned in, sensing the balance shift. "You walk around like this is yours," Janelle went on, her voice stronger now. "But without your little crew, you're just another coward, hiding behind cheap words and weak friends." Ryan's expression cracked. He blinked fast. His jaw flexed as if his teeth were grinding. The courtyard was silent, except for the wind. Then he stepped in. Too close. He was face to face with Jada now, the mask of confidence pulling tight across his features. "Say that again," he growled, the words brittle in his mouth. "You heard her," Jada said, her voice smooth as steel. "You just don't like the truth when it's said to your face." Ryan's chest rose sharply, his fists clenched. Around them, students froze, unsure whether to back away or lean in. Ryan's glare jumped to the crowd for backup. He needed it, but the usual laughter wasn't coming as quickly now. "You think you're tough?" he snapped, clinging to control. "You think you can run your mouths and not pay for it?" "We don't think," Janelle answered, her tone cutting through everything like a knife. "We know." And that was all it took. Ryan snapped. Without warning, his arm shot out, hand slamming into Jada's shoulder with full force. She staggered back a step under the hit, catching herself instinctively, her feet grounding like stone. She didn't fall, but something else did. The silence. It broke, and the storm finally arrived. The crowd's gasp hit like a thunderclap, sharp, collective, unmistakable. Dozens of students froze mid-step, inhaling as the tension finally broke into open conflict. It wasn't suspense anymore. It was action, real, raw, and impossible to look away from. Brent saw the moment and tried to capitalize on it, stepping toward Janelle with a smug, hungry grin. He slapped the books from her arms, sending pages flying across the concrete like fallen leaves, mocking the humiliation they had endured just days earlier. Zach followed instantly, his shoulder slamming into Janelle's with deliberate force. "What now?" he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Gonna go cry to Daddy?" That was it. That was the moment everything shifted, not quietly, but fully and forever. Jada's eyes locked on Ryan, burning like a fuse reaching its end. Her voice came low, but clear and thunderous in its stillness. "No," she said, breath even. "We're done running." And just like that, the storm broke. With a movement as smooth as breath, Jada stepped forward, her palm striking Ryan square in the chest. The force was sharp, focused, practiced. He staggered back, stunned, the breath knocked from his lungs. The look in his eyes changed from amusement to alarm. Beside her, Janelle moved like water, dropping low, sweeping Brent's legs from under him in one fluid, perfect motion. He hit the ground hard, the laughter stolen from his lungs in an instant. The courtyard erupted. Students screamed, scrambled back, forming a wide circle around the fight. Shock and thrill collided in their voices as the energy pulsed through the open space like a live wire. Ryan tried to recover, but the swagger was gone. His swing toward Jada came fast but wild, and she slipped beneath it easily, years of training tightening every move. Her fist connected with his gut, fast and clean, folding him forward with a grunt. Brent, gasping, tried to rise, but Janelle was already there, firm grip on his shoulder, twisting and pinning him before he could find his balance. Every motion she made was deliberate, grounded in technique, not rage. This wasn't a brawl. It was control. Zach lunged at her recklessly, but Janelle turned with precision, letting his momentum carry him past her before catching his arm mid-charge and flipping him to the pavement with a powerful thud. The crowd flinched with him, watching him hit the ground hard beside Brent, tangled and disoriented. Ryan, clutching his ribs, stumbled toward Jada again, snarling, but she met him without hesitation. A sharp uppercut connected under his chin, snapping his head back and sending him stumbling. He lost his footing, dazed. The twins didn't flinch. They didn't pause. They didn't check the crowd for approval. Every strike, every step was guided by their father's lessons: calm, control, clarity. They weren't fighting to prove themselves. They were fighting because they had been pushed past the line. The courtyard, once filled with casual conversation and careless footsteps, now buzzed with intensity, so real it felt like the very ground was humming. The crowd had widened, a circle of spectators now completely silent, eyes wide, breath held, watching something they didn't expect and couldn't ignore. Jada and Janelle moved together with the ease of trust, bodies synchronized like twin storms finally let loose. Every motion had purpose, every counter was precise, no rage, just resolve. Ryan swung again, but slower this time. Hesitation now haunted him. Jada moved faster, ducking and delivering a strike to his ribs that bent him sideways. "You thought we'd just take it," she said through her breath, voice calm even as her body moved with precision. "You thought if you pushed hard enough, we'd break." Each word landed like her strikes, undeniable, sharp, echoing in the minds of everyone watching. Ryan gasped, not just from pain, but from realization. Brent, now upright but staggering, charged blindly toward Janelle, but she was ready. Her palm struck his chest like lightning, stopping him cold, the sound of impact echoing as his body collapsed backward. His breath caught in his throat, arms clutching his center as he curled onto the ground, stunned. "You picked the wrong fight," Janelle said, her voice cutting clean through the silence. She stepped forward, just one quiet step, and Brent didn't dare try to rise again. He wouldn't. Not soon. Zach, desperate now, saw the tide turning, and that's when he made his final move. But this time, the audience wasn't cheering. They were watching history unfold. From the ground, Zach had grabbed a broken strip of wood, likely a splintered piece from a weathered bench, and gripped it in both hands as he charged toward Janelle in a burst of reckless desperation. But she saw him coming before he even crossed half the distance. Her senses sharpened, her body calm and alert. not from rage, but from training. She shifted effortlessly to the side, her movements smooth and exact. With one hand, she snatched his wrist mid-swing, locking it tight. A twist, quick and decisive, sent the makeshift weapon clattering harmlessly to the ground. In the same motion, she pivoted and drove her elbow into the side of Zach's jaw. His legs buckled. He collapsed, dazed and disoriented, the fight knocked clean out of him. "Cheap shots won't save you now," Janelle said quietly, but every word cut through the thick air like steel, reaching the edge of the now silent crowd. Their laughter had vanished. All that remained was awe and fear. Ryan, humiliated and boiling with fury, lunged at Jada once again. But this time, his wild fists held no power, only panic. Jada saw the attack unravel before it reached her. She ducked low, grabbed his wrist, twisted it, and stepped into him with a sharp knee to the stomach. The force folded Ryan in half. His breath left him in a strangled gasp as he dropped to the ground, clutching his ribs. "You had every chance to walk away," Jada said, her voice strong and level, aimed not just at Ryan, but at the entire crowd gathered around them. "But you kept pushing." She released his wrist and let him drop fully to the pavement. He curled inward, groaning, the weight of the moment heavy on his chest. Janelle stepped beside her sister. Both of them stood tall, chests rising and falling with slow, deliberate breath. They had walked onto this campus side by side, heads high, and now they stood the same way, but something had changed. The ground felt like it finally belonged to them, not by invitation, by resolve. Around them, the crowd stood motionless, no more jeering, no more laughter. What had started as a public humiliation had become something no one expected, a reckoning, not a schoolyard fight, not revenge. A message written in every movement of their bodies: we will not be broken. Janelle turned her gaze on Brent, who had groaned and attempted to push himself upright once more, stubborn, prideful, and slow to learn. She stepped forward, planted her foot firmly on his chest, and pressed him back down with controlled strength. "Stay down," she told him. Not a threat, a fact. Jada's eyes swept the courtyard. She met the gaze of every student who dared to hold it. Her look was clear, powerful, and final. She didn't have to say the words. They were written across her face. This ends now. But both sisters knew, deep down, that this wasn't the end of the battle. Not really. They felt it in the way the crowd shifted uncomfortably, in the murmur of whispered rumors already spinning. They felt it in the fact that no teachers had shown up until now, and they felt it in the silence that followed, stretched and strange, like time itself was trying to catch up. The cost of standing their ground would come. Of that, they were certain. But for the first time since stepping through the gates of Rosewood Hills, they felt no doubt. They had drawn the line, and no one would cross it again without consequence. Around them, the once rowdy crowd stood frozen in an uneasy stillness. The same students who had laughed, pointed, filmed, now stood pale and wide-eyed, as if they'd just seen something far greater than they bargained for. The hunger for drama had faded. In its place, the weight of realization settled in, a truth too heavy to look away from. No teacher had intervened during the fight. Not one adult had stepped in while everything unfolded in full view. But now, as if summoned by the echo of what had happened, they began to appear, trickling into the courtyard with tight expressions, confusion in their eyes, concern painted over faces that had looked the other way for too long. And though they didn't say it aloud, it was clear. They had seen this coming. Maybe not this exact moment, but the fracture in the polished facade, the pressure building beneath the surface, and now that it had burst wide open, no one could pretend not to know. Then came the voice, firm, clipped, undeniable. "That's enough." Mr. Carpenter, the assistant principal, stood at the edge of the courtyard, eyes narrowed, jaw tight. His tone wasn't just disciplinary, it was stunned, because whether he admitted it or not, he'd just witnessed two students stop an entire system of silence, and there was no going back. Principal Carpenter pushed through the wall of students, his steps brisk, his expression caught somewhere between outrage and quiet relief that he'd arrived only after the last punch had been thrown. His eyes swept across the scene, from the boys slumped and bruised on the ground to the Rivers twins standing upright at the center of it all, calm and controlled, breathing steady like they hadn't just taken on 3 bullies in front of the entire school. "What is going on here?" Carpenter barked, more as a requirement than a real question. The answer was written all over the courtyard. Before Jada or Janelle could speak, Ryan coughed and forced his voice through clenched teeth. "They attacked us," he gasped, desperation wrapped in arrogance. "We didn't do anything, they just lost it." The crowd shifted, silence frayed at the edges. A few students glanced away, unwilling to look Jada or Janelle in the eye. Others stared at Ryan with hesitation, like they were finally starting to question whether following him had ever been the right choice. Jada clenched her jaw, but held her calm. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, steady and unmoving. "Control is power. Speak only when it counts." She looked straight into Carpenter's eyes and said, with voice firm and level, "They've been targeting us since the day we got here. Today, they went too far. We defended ourselves. That's all." Carpenter's face twitched, not in surprise, but discomfort. The kind of discomfort that comes from seeing the truth too clearly to ignore. Still, his voice remained clipped and formal. "We'll sort this out inside." There was no reassurance in his tone, no promise of fairness, just procedure. "All of you, let's go." Jada and Janelle didn't argue. They exchanged a glance, quiet and understood, and followed without a word, leaving behind the shaken crowd whose appetite for spectacle had curdled into silent unease. Inside the administrative building, everything felt colder, tighter. The walls closer, the chairs harder. The twins sat outside the headmaster's office, side by side, composed, hands resting calmly on their knees. Across from them, Ryan, Zach, and Brent exaggerated their injuries to anyone who would listen, rewriting the story with the confidence of boys who had always been believed before, but their performance didn't move Jada or Janelle because they knew who they were, and more importantly, they knew the truth. Soon the front door opened. Derek Rivers walked in, his steps measured, his expression unreadable. But behind the quiet force of his presence, a storm waited, contained only by his will. He looked first to his daughters, reading not just their faces, but their spirit. When their eyes met his, steady, unbroken, a flicker of pride passed between them, silent but understood. Then he turned to Headmaster Harrington, all crisp suit and cold distance, the kind of man who managed things more than he led. "We'll conduct a full investigation," Harrington said, his tone flat, his fingers steepled neatly above polished wood. "But until we review everything, I'm afraid your daughters will be suspended. Effective immediately." Derek's voice was low but unmoving. "My daughters defended themselves, that much is obvious. But honestly, I expected no better from this institution." Harrington's face tightened, but he didn't argue, because he couldn't. Moments later, Ryan's parents arrived. Sandra Mallory swept in like she owned the building, heels clicking, voice already rising with outrage. Her husband, Greg, followed close behind, face tight with suppressed fury. "This is outrageous," Sandra said, cutting through the room like a blade. "Our son was assaulted, and these girls are only being suspended? They should be expelled." "Arrested." Her voice grew sharper with every sentence, feeding on its own volume. Harrington tried to interject with vague promises, but she wouldn't stop, not until punishment matched her pride. Derek didn't respond. He just watched. His gaze stayed locked on hers, not cold, not emotional, just unshakable, and that, more than words, made her flinch. Her rant ran dry, her volume dropped. "This isn't over," she spat, narrowing her eyes at Derek like a threat. "No," Derek said calmly, "it's not." But the way he said it made everyone in the room feel the weight of what was coming. Not a threat, a promise. Suspension papers were handed out. Impersonal, mechanical. Harrington offered nothing but procedure. As Jada and Janelle stood, they held their heads high, not in defiance, in truth, in dignity. They had not started this fight, but they had ended it with clarity. The courtyard fight was over. But the real battle, the one for truth, for fairness, for dignity, had only just begun. This fight wouldn't end with fists alone, and as they stepped out of the office, their father walking between them, Jada and Janelle understood with complete clarity. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. At home, the silence was almost too quiet. The breeze stirred the trees outside, the soft hum of traffic drifting faintly through the air, but the calm felt false, like the sky before a thunderclap. The storm that had begun in the polished halls of Rosewood Hills had followed them here, waiting just beyond the edges of the quiet street. Inside the house, the air was heavier, not with fear, not even with regret, but with the weight of knowing that the worst wasn't over, that the Mallorys wouldn't let it end clean. Derek sat at the kitchen table, relaxed but never unaware, his posture still, his gaze focused on the window that overlooked the street, like he could already see the trouble before it arrived. Across from him, his daughters sat shoulder to shoulder. They didn't speak, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was solid, ready. "You knew they'd come," Jada said finally, her voice even. It wasn't a question. Derek gave a slow nod, his eyes still fixed outside. "People like them," he said quietly. "Don't take losses well. They believe they're supposed to win, no matter what the truth says. And when they don't, they bring the fight to your doorstep, thinking you'll be caught off guard." Janelle turned her eyes toward the window. Her hands rested calmly on the table, fingers loose but prepared, the same readiness that had carried her through the courtyard fight, without hesitation. "They think it's over because we walked away," she said, her tone steady but sharp. "But they've never really known what strength looks like." Before Derek could reply, the sound of tires crunching against gravel snapped through the air like a signal. A car door slammed, then another, loud, purposeful. The rhythm of entitlement and outrage. Jada said it aloud, though no one needed the confirmation. "They're here." Derek stood in one smooth motion. He wasn't tense, he was grounded. Not just ready for conflict, ready to teach through it. "Stay behind me," he said, not out of fear, but because some lessons had to be witnessed to be understood. Before the doorbell could ring, before a single knock could fall, Derek opened the door himself, stepping onto the porch with the quiet command of a man who had faced worse storms and refused to yield. Sandra Mallory was already halfway up the steps, her fury barely disguised beneath a polished mask, expensive sunglasses perched on her head like a crown she hadn't earned. Her posture was stiff with fury, her eyes burning beneath her carefully crafted exterior. Greg Mallory stood beside her, his jaw tight, his fists clenched, his rage barely restrained. "You think you're going to get away with this?" Sandra hissed, skipping any greeting. Her voice was sharp, stabbing the air between them. "You think you can let your daughters lay hands on our son and just walk away like nothing happened?" Derek didn't blink. "Your son attacked my daughters," he said, his voice calm and full, the kind of voice that doesn't raise but still fills every corner of a room. "They defended themselves. That's the truth, whether you accept it or not." "Don't you dare act like you're the victim," Greg snapped, stepping forward now, his tone unsteady with rage. "Your girls are animals, just like you." The words didn't echo. They sank like poison into the space between them. But Derek didn't move, didn't blink. He let the insult linger, fully aware that it said more about the man who spoke it than anything else ever could. Then he answered, not with anger, but with unwavering truth. "You made your judgment before you even knew our names," he said, his voice like stone. "But the facts don't change. You raised a bully, and today he found out what happens when a bully crosses the wrong line." Sandra's expression twisted. Her mouth opened again, ready to spit more venom. But before she could speak, Greg surged forward, his fury finally breaking loose. "You think you can talk down to us? In our town?" he growled. And then, with no warning, he swung. A heavy, wild punch, fast but not smart. But Derek was already moving. Before Greg's fist could land, Derek turned with quiet precision, his hand snapping up, catching Greg's wrist mid-swing. The blow stopped cold, not with brute strength, but with calm, trained control. Greg's eyes widened in disbelief as Derek twisted his arm just enough to shift his balance, forcing him to stumble sideways before releasing him, not with violence, but with efficiency. "You've made your choice," Derek said flatly, eyes locked onto Greg's with the weight of unshaken authority. "Now live with the consequences." But Greg wasn't done. Too angry and too blind to recognize the reality unfolding around him, he lunged again, both arms swinging in a clumsy attempt to bring Derek down through sheer weight. Sandra, shrieking something broken and wild, followed, clawing at Derek's arm in a storm of chaos and ego. Derek didn't panic. He stepped back just enough to let their fury work against them, then moved. Fast, clean. Greg's momentum carried him forward, and with one pull and a pivot, Derek sent him crashing onto the porch floor. The boards trembled beneath the impact. Sandra screamed and lashed out, but Derek caught her wrist mid-swing and turned it behind her back with sharp precision, not to hurt her, but to hold her still. She hissed through clenched teeth, breath ragged with fear. "You came to my home," Derek said, his voice low, unshaken. "You thought you'd bring fear into this house, but fear doesn't live here." And in that moment, on that porch, in that silence, the truth settled like a shadow across them all. The Mallorys were trapped, not by force, but by the weight of their own misjudgment. Greg groaned on the ground, his pride more bruised than his body, his chest heaving as he tried to swallow his defeat. But it was visible now, in the slack of his mouth, the tremor in his limbs, the realization that none of this had gone the way he imagined. Sandra twisted against Derek's grip, her voice cracking with panic. "Let me go! Do you know who we are?" Derek's expression didn't change. "I know exactly who you are," he said calmly, releasing her wrist without resistance, not because she'd won anything, but because she no longer posed a threat. "And I'm not impressed." Greg, still trembling with fury and humiliation, pushed himself to his feet and charged again, wild and heavy, but sloppy. Derek pivoted and let him pass, guiding his stumbling weight straight into the porch railing with a crash that rattled wood and bone alike. "You think this is over?" Greg barked, trying to catch his breath, spitting words like venom. "You and your girls, you're done." Derek stepped forward, calm and deliberate, his voice as firm as stone. "No," he said, "you are." Greg swung once more, all rage and no technique. But Derek's arm moved like clockwork, catching him, twisting, and driving him down flat onto the porch again. The air knocked out of him in a gasping wheeze. He lay sprawled in the shadow of a man he'd underestimated from the start. Sandra's scream tore through the air, but it wasn't anger anymore. It was fear, real fear. She clawed at Derek's arm, but her hands shook. The rage that once fueled her had drained away, leaving only the panic of seeing her husband brought low. Derek let her go. She staggered back, breath unsteady, chest heaving. No longer the woman who had marched up with fire in her eyes, but someone who now saw clearly where that fire had led. Inside the doorway, Jada and Janelle stood in silence, watching everything unfold. Their faces were still, their eyes sharp. There was no fear in them, only understanding. They had seen these movements before, in the quiet discipline of their father's teachings, but now they saw it not as theory, but alive, real, absolute. "This is what they always do," Derek said, loud enough for both his daughters and the Mallorys to hear. "They come into our lives, our homes, our space, thinking they can break us with threats and power, but they forget." He turned to face them fully now, voice unshaken. "We don't fold, we stand." Sandra looked to her husband, who lay wheezing on the ground, then back to Derek, her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Her strength had vanished, her confidence hollowed out by the truth she couldn't outrun. "Call the police!" she screamed suddenly, her voice cracking. "He attacked us!" But the words rang empty, even to her. "You came here," Derek reminded her, voice calm, never raised. "You brought violence to my door, and now you'll live with what you brought." Greg, still slumped against the porch boards, lifted himself onto one elbow. His face was flushed, jaw trembling, eyes dazed, not just from the impact, but from the realization dawning on him. He had lost, not just the fight, but the illusion that he was the stronger man. And for the first time in a very long time, he knew it. Greg had believed strength was something loud, until that moment stripped him of every illusion. There, laid out on the porch, breathless and broken, he finally saw the truth. Power without control was just noise, and Derek had never needed to shout to own the space he stood in. In the distance, sirens began to rise, first faint, then cutting through the heavy stillness like a blade. The sound swept over the neighborhood, pulling curious faces to windows and driveways. Neighbors emerged from their homes slowly, not with alarm, but with the quiet satisfaction of those who had watched the Mallorys walk with too much pride for too long. And now, they were watching them fall. Derek didn't flinch. He stood at the center of his porch, unshaken, his daughters on either side, tall, composed, and proud. Whatever the sirens would bring, they were ready, because they had already won the fight that mattered. Not the one of fists and bruises, but of presence, of truth, of refusing to break when the world expected them to fall. This wasn't just about defending themselves. It was about showing Rosewood Hills, the school, and the Mallorys themselves. We will not be erased. As the flashing lights rounded the corner, and the first cruiser rolled into the driveway, Derek's voice broke the silence with quiet finality. "You came looking for a fight," he said, his words steady, his gaze locked on Greg. "Well, you found one." The red and blue strobes lit the house like a heartbeat, washing across the walls in rhythmic pulses. The storm hadn't passed. It had only changed shape. Fists were traded now for badges and notepads, but the center of it all remained unchanged. Derek Rivers stood tall, his daughters at his sides, an unbroken line. The officers stepped from their vehicles cautiously, trained hands hovering near their belts. Their eyes swept across the porch, two people on the ground, disheveled and wheezing, one man standing tall. The air hung with tension. And something else, clarity. Across the street, neighbors clustered on their lawns. Some whispered, some held phones. Most simply watched, their expressions unreadable, but not unsympathetic. Then Sandra's voice shattered the quiet, high-pitched, desperate. "Officer, arrest him!" she cried, rushing forward, pointing at Derek like a villain in her own story. "He attacked us. He assaulted us in front of our home." But Officer Clean, older, sharp-eyed and steady, raised a hand, not reacting with urgency, but control. He scanned the scene, not just with suspicion, but with quiet wisdom. He'd seen this before, rage hiding behind status, entitlement dressed up as fear. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "take a breath. I need to hear from everyone, and I'll start with the homeowner." Sandra opened her mouth, her voice catching, but something in Clena's tone made her step back, her energy faltering. She returned to Greg's side, who remained slumped and groaning, still gripping his ribs, as if pain could rewrite truth. Officer Clean approached Derek next. "Sir, can you tell me what happened?" Derek met his eyes calmly, his posture straight, his voice low but steady. "They came here uninvited, angry about an incident at school. They confronted me on my porch, threatened me. Then Derek nodded toward Greg. "Through the first punch, I defended myself and my family." "And your daughters?" Clena asked, eyes flicking to Jada and Janelle, who stood silent but unwavering. "They stayed inside," Derek answered clearly, "just like I told them to." Cleney gave a slow, thoughtful nod. He said nothing, but it was clear. He had heard the truth before it was even spoken. He turned to Sandra and Greg, notepad ready, expression neutral, but tight. Sandra dove into her version of events with frantic urgency, piling words on top of lies, shaping herself as the victim, Derek as the aggressor. But her performance fell apart under Clean's quiet gaze. Her voice cracked, her logic unraveled. The longer she spoke, the less convincing she became. "And you claim you were defending yourselves?" Clean asked at last, calm but pointed. "We came to talk," Sandra insisted, but her voice was rising again, not with confidence, but panic. "He attacked us." Clena's eyes narrowed slightly, and then he turned toward the neighbors, dozens now, standing in clusters, some filming, some murmuring, all watching. "I'm going to need witness statements," Clena said, his voice carrying clearly across the lawn. "Anyone who saw what happened, please step forward." There was a pause, a stretch of silence as long and tight as wire. Then, one by one, hands began to rise. From the older man who had watched from his porch across the street, from the young mother 2 doors down, still holding her child, from the couple who had heard the shouting and come out quietly to see, and stayed to witness the truth. Sandra's face went pale. Greg said nothing, and Jada and Janelle, they didn't speak either. They didn't need to. The world was speaking for them now. There was a beat of silence, heavy, uncertain. Then, slowly, as if stirred by a long dormant sense of justice that had finally found its moment, a neighbor stepped forward. An older man from across the street, his face lined with age and truth, his eyes sharp with clarity. "I saw the whole thing," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They came out of that car yelling. The man threw the first punch. The homeowner didn't move until he had no choice." Then another voice, and another. A growing chorus of neighbors, voices steady, memories sharp, each one cutting through Sandra's frantic lies like sunlight through fog. Together, they rebuilt the truth in front of everyone, their accounts confirming everything Derek had already said. Officer Clean listened carefully, his pen gliding steadily across his notepad, and when the last neighbor finished, he closed it with a quiet snap, a sound that landed heavier than the sirens minutes before. "We'll continue this at the station," he said, no longer asking but instructing. "But based on what I've heard so far, it seems we've got more questions for you two." He looked directly at Sandra and Greg. Their faces went pale under the flashing police lights. Officers moved in, helping Greg to his feet. They cuffed him gently, but without hesitation. Sandra's voice rose again, but her fury had thinned. Now it carried panic, not power. Her words faltered as the truth wrapped tightly around her like a net she hadn't seen coming. Derek stood motionless. His daughters stood at his side. None of them spoke because they didn't need to. As the Mallorys were led away, Derek didn't look at them. He looked past them, toward the horizon, toward what came next. Because this fight had never been about fists. Not really. It was about standing when others wanted you to fall, about showing the Mallorys, the school, the town, that no matter how loud the lies or how long the pressure, they would not bend, they would not break. And now, everyone knew it. The police station had that cold, weighty stillness of places that had seen too many truths ignored, too many stories rewritten by the powerful. But as Derek and his daughters sat quietly in the metal chairs of the waiting area, there was no fear in them, no shaking hands, no second guessing, just quiet patience. They had weathered greater storms. Officer Cleaney moved through the station like a man who understood lies the moment they were spoken. He reviewed statements. He collected the footage, doorbell cameras, porch videos, street angles, willingly offered by neighbors who, for once, wanted to make sure justice was done right. Derek watched with quiet focus, not suspicion, but cautious respect. Clean wasn't moving quickly. He was moving carefully. He wasn't listening for volume. He was listening for truth. Jada and Janelle sat close, their shoulders square, their posture steady. Inside, they could feel the slow churn of exhaustion and memory rising, but they didn't let it show. They had faced worse and come through, and they would come through this. Finally, Clean approached, his notepad tucked under one arm, his expression thoughtful. "Mr. Rivers," he began, voice measured, "I've reviewed the witness statements and the video footage." He paused, letting the words land. "It's clear you didn't initiate the confrontation. Everything shows your actions were defensive." Derek nodded slightly, not with relief or triumph, but with quiet steadiness. This was never about victory. It was about the truth. Clean shifted his weight, continuing, "The footage shows the Mallorys approached aggressively. They stepped onto your porch first. They shouted. They struck first. We have it from multiple angles." A soft breath escaped Jada and Janelle. Not quite a sigh, just the quiet release of pressure that had been coiled too long inside their chests. "But," Clean added, his voice still firm, "due to the severity of the injuries and the claims being made, we will need to file a full report. There may still be legal proceedings, but I want you to know..." He looked Derek in the eye. "From what I've seen, the evidence is clearly in your favor." Derek didn't hesitate. "We'll give you everything you need," he said calmly. As they followed Officer Clean toward the interview room, Jada and Janelle walked beside their father, not afraid, not bowed. The moment was heavy, but it wasn't a burden. It was proof of everything they had endured and everything they had overcome. To reach this point had taken strength, endurance, and silence. And now, seated beside their father, Jada and Janelle spoke not with hesitation, but with calm, deliberate voices, recounting the events of the day with clarity. They left no room for interpretation, no space for the truth to be twisted. Piece by piece, the story unfolded, not a tale spun from anger or fear, but a clean, unbroken chain of facts leading from the first shove in the courtyard to the final confrontation on their doorstep. They spoke of the days of taunts, of the cruel prank that tried to humiliate them, of being pushed and pushed until there was no room left but to stand their ground. They didn't speak as victims. They spoke as survivors. And the more they spoke, the more impossible it became to deny the shape of the truth. It filled the room, unshakable, real. Later, after the interview, Derek led them to a quieter corner of the station. The noise had faded, but the weight remained. "You see how it works," he said softly. Not as instruction, but as something deeper, a reminder, a truth they had always carried inside. They'll twist it, try to own the story, but the truth waits, and when it's time, it stands. Jada looked up at him, her eyes bright with something stronger than exhaustion. "We're not done yet," she said firmly. Janelle nodded beside her, her voice steady. "But we're getting there." Officer Clean returned, his face more focused now, a notebook tucked under his arm. "There's something else," he said carefully. "One of your neighbors mentioned earlier issues at the school. We're pulling footage from Rosewood Hills surveillance now. If we find a pattern, it'll help clear this up faster." At those words, a quiet understanding passed between Derek and his daughters. They had carried the weight of all those hallway stares and cold silences alone, endured while administrators looked away. But now, maybe the truth would stretch all the way back. Maybe it wouldn't just clear their names. It would expose the rot beneath the polished stone of Rosewood Hills. "Do it," Derek said without pause. "Let the whole story come out." Kalane gave a tight nod and turned to make the call, his steps filled with quiet purpose. In the silence that followed, Derek and his daughters sat together, steady, unbroken. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the soft hum of the station like a clock marking the slow but steady unraveling of lies. Across the room, through the narrow window of an adjoining office, they saw Greg and Sandra Mallory. Both sat separately now, and neither looked like the people who had stormed onto their porch hours earlier. Sandra's face, once pinched with entitlement, had cracked. Her eyes darted from one officer to the next, lips pursed into a trembling line as the fear underneath finally began to show. Greg sat slouched, his shoulders no longer squared, not just from pain, but from the slow collapse of certainty. He didn't look up. Not at the window, not at Derek, not even at himself. Officer Klen returned, this time with a thick folder under his arm. He moved like a man who had just stopped listening to stories and started following facts. He sat down, opened the folder, and placed the first photo under the harsh station light. It was Greg, caught mid-swing on a neighbor's security camera, his face twisted, his fist thrown toward Derek's head. Freeze-frame proof. Unforgiving. Undeniable. Without a word, Clean spread out more images, still after still, each one showing escalation, aggression, not defense, not confusion, only fury, and the man who had brought it to another man's home. Derek studied them with quiet eyes. No surprise, just confirmation. The truth hadn't wandered. It had simply waited. Then, Clean placed down another set. "These are from the school," he said, "pulled from internal cameras." The grainy footage showed lockers defaced in red paint. Brent knocking Janelle's books to the floor, Zach laughing, Ryan stepping in, smug. Then, the shove in the courtyard, the moment it all snapped. Jada and Janelle breathed, not relief, but something close. A slow, earned exhale, a burden, finally, beginning to shift. "We have a strong case building in your favor," Cleany said, voice solid now. "The statements, the footage, even a few student confessions. It all lines up." Derek gave a small nod, not of victory, but of readiness. "And the Mallorys?" he asked, voice calm, carrying not anger, but duty. Cleany didn't flinch. "They'll be facing charges," he said. "Harassment, assault, trespassing. We're processing the paperwork now." He closed the folder. "It's not over yet, but you're no longer standing alone." Jada looked at her father, then to her sister, and finally at the door that led back to the world beyond the station. They weren't finished, but for the first time, the truth had a voice louder than the lies. Cleana's mouth tightened for a brief moment, not with doubt, but discipline. He was the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice to be heard. "They're in deep," he said finally, his voice edged with quiet finality. "They came here full of bluster, thinking their story alone would carry weight. But the more evidence we gather, the faster their accusations fall apart. And the more they talk, the deeper they dig their own hole." Derek's eyes shifted toward the glass partition. Another officer had entered the room where Sandra and Greg Mallory sat. He placed a thick stack of documents on the table with a weighty thud, a sound that seemed to ripple through the entire building. Sandra's mouth moved rapidly, her voice muffled behind the glass, but her rising panic needed no translation. Her hands cut sharply through the air, frantic, desperate, trying to slice through the facts closing in around her. Greg, once filled with fury, sat silent now. His hands were clasped tightly, knuckles pale, his gaze locked downward as though he could hold off the consequences just by refusing to meet them. "Let them see it all," Derek said quietly. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, but Kleena heard him and nodded once, firmly. "Let them see what happens when you push too far." "We intend to," Kleena replied, closing the folder with finality, as if sealing the Mallory's fate between its pages. Moments later, a younger officer joined them. His uniform was crisp, but his expression had already been carved by hard truths. He handed Kleena a printed transcript. "2 student statements," he said. "They confirm prior harassment at the school, lines up with what Mr. Rivers and his daughters described." Kleena flipped through the pages, each line sharpening the clarity in his eyes. "That should be enough," he said finally, laying the transcript down with a quiet certainty. "We'll move forward with charges, assault, trespassing, and depending on what else surfaces from the school, possibly harassment." Derek said nothing. No shift in breath, no outward reaction, but Jada and Janelle saw it. The small change in his posture, the way his shoulders eased, the quiet dignity of a man who didn't fight for victory, only for truth. Through the glass, Sandra's voice spiked again, sharp, panicked, no longer cloaked in confidence. Greg shrank further, his shoulders caving, his head bowed low under the weight of everything they'd refused to face until now. Kleena turned back to Derek and his daughters. "You've handled yourselves well," he said quietly. "This won't be easy, and it's not over, but you did the right thing." Derek inclined his head, not out of gratitude, but acknowledgement. He had never needed applause. He only ever asked that the truth be allowed to stand. Across the station, officers began processing the Mallorys, firm, methodical. No more performance, no more privilege, just the steady march of justice. The Rivers family remained seated, their posture unshaken. The tide hadn't just turned. It had begun to cleanse everything in its path. The lies were being swept away, and the truth, long buried, had finally found open air. The station itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the walls had absorbed the full weight of everything that had just come to light. For once, the air felt heavy, not with doubt, but with clarity, too real, too solid to be denied, too sharp to be reshaped by the hands of those who thought themselves untouchable. Derek sat between his daughters, unmoved, resolute, watching as the officers carried out their tasks with new precision, no longer chasing the truth, but protecting it. And across the glass, Sandra still paced like a caged animal, eyes wild, fists tight, searching for some thread, any thread, to pull, to undo, to escape. But there was nothing left to unravel, only knots she had tied herself. Greg didn't move. He sat with his elbows on his knees, his head low. The fire that once fueled his rage had gone cold. All that remained was the echo of his own choices, and the silence that came with realizing they couldn't be undone. Kleena stood at the center of it all, calm, centered. His hands moved through the final statements and footage collected since the Mallorys arrived, neighbors' testimonies, doorbell cameras, student accounts. A story laid bare, without gaps, without excuses. He turned back to Derek. "We've completed our preliminary findings," he said. "The charges against you and your daughters will be dropped immediately. The evidence leaves no room for any other decision." Jada and Janelle looked at each other. No smiles, no outbursts, just a quiet glance. A shared moment of knowing. Not surprise, only confirmation. They had always trusted the truth would rise. Now, the world would have to reckon with it. Vindication, not the kind that shouts or celebrates, but the kind that settles quietly in your chest, deep, steady, certain. Derek inclined his head slightly, his composure unchanged. But beneath the still surface, there was a shift, small, internal, powerful. The release of a weight he'd carried alone, for his daughters, for his family, a weight he never let show, but one that had never left his shoulders. "The Mallorys?" he asked, not because he needed the answer, but because it mattered that it be spoken aloud, clearly, for all to hear. Clean's jaw tensed slightly as he replied, his words crisp and deliberate. "They will face charges," he confirmed. "Assault, harassment, trespassing, obstruction. Their actions at the school and here at your home, fully documented. They won't be talking their way out of this." Almost on cue, another officer entered the holding area. The door clicked open with a sharp twist. He motioned to Sandra and Greg to stand. Sandra's voice, shrill and rising with panic, cut through the air. "You have no right!" she cried, voice cracking under pressure, but her words didn't land. They fell like brittle leaves against the steady commands of officers who no longer listened to excuses. Greg, drained of fire, stood slowly. His shoulders slumped. His eyes briefly met Derek's, but only for a moment. He couldn't hold the gaze of the man he had misjudged so badly. The cuffs clicked shut, and his eyes dropped to the floor. The twins watched silently. No cheers, no smug glances, just a quiet, growing satisfaction, the kind that comes from standing firm against injustice and refusing to bend. They had met hatred with courage. They had answered cruelty not with fear, but with strength, with discipline, with love, for each other, and for the truth. As the Mallorys were led away, heavy with the finality of consequence, Officer Claney turned once more to the family. His voice softened, but his words carried weight. "You held your ground with honor," he said. "That matters more than you know." Derek offered no reply. He didn't need to. His eyes followed the Mallorys until they disappeared through the station doors, swallowed by the same system they once believed would shield them. But that system had shown the world who they truly were. The station began to exhale. The chaotic energy of the day slowly receded, replaced by the calm rhythm of paperwork, reports, final statements. Clean assured Derek that formal exoneration documents would be delivered within the hour. The school would be notified as well. That was a battle Derek was ready to finish, gladly. Jada and Janelle sat upright, wearied by hours of interrogation and waiting, but poised and unshaken, their eyes sharp, their shoulders squared. They were ready to leave the station behind, not as victims, but as victors. As the three of them stood, framed by the last light filtering through the windows, there was power in their silhouette, a wordless bond that said, "Whatever comes next, we face it together." Not as background characters in someone else's story, but as the authors of our own. They had fought, they had endured, and now they had won. The morning sun stretched long over Rosewood Hills Academy, casting clean light across familiar paths and red brick walls. But today, something in the air had shifted, clearer, lighter, as if the storm had finally passed and left the world rinsed clean. The courtyard, once thick with judgment and whispers, now buzzed with something else. Tension, yes, but not menace. This was the unsettled hum of change, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but lingers, in glances, in silence, in the knowledge that something deep has been exposed. Word had spread, fast, not gossip, facts. Facts carried on official letters, recordings, and witness statements. The kind of truth that couldn't be ignored. Students who once laughed along with Ryan and his crew now gathered in small, cautious clusters, their voices quieter. their glances darting toward the entrance. The twins were returning today. Teachers who once turned away, who had chosen silence over intervention, now moved stiffly, burdened by shame they could no longer hide. Inside the administrative office, Headmaster Harrington stood behind his desk, posture tight, eyes dull with weight. In his hands were police reports, clear, indisputable. The names stood out in bold: Ryan Mallory, Zach Carver, Brent Larson, and below them the final line: expulsion, effective immediately. Across from him sat Derek, steady, composed. His eyes met Harrington's with quiet certainty. Beside him, Jada and Janelle sat poised, their uniforms crisp, their expressions calm. They were no longer asking for justice. They had brought it with them. "The board met early this morning," Harrington began. His voice held the strain of a man who had failed and now had to admit it. "In light of the findings and overwhelming evidence of assault and harassment, the suspensions have been reversed. Effective immediately, your daughters are reinstated. They may return to class today." He cleared his throat, voice faltering slightly as he gripped the papers tighter. "And the students responsible have been expelled permanently." There was silence, not because anyone needed time, but because the weight of that moment demanded it. Derek's voice, when it came, was calm, even. "It's the decision that should have been made from the beginning. No venom, no pride, just the truth, spoken plainly." Harrington's lips thinned. Something flickered in his eyes. Regret? Shame? Both? "We failed your family," he said, voice lower, heavier. "We failed our duty to protect all our students. That will change." Jada met his gaze head-on. "See that it does," she said. Her voice was steady, but behind it was fire. "And history." Janelle spoke next. "Not just for us," she added, "for every student who doesn't fit your mold." Harrington nodded, slowly, silently. The papers trembled slightly in his grip as he finally set them down. When they rose, Derek placed a hand on each daughter's shoulder, not as a shield, but as a signal of pride. Together, they walked into the hallway. The same hallway that once made them shrink, now echoing beneath their sure footsteps. Students turned to look, some with guilt, some with respect, but none with laughter. Not anymore. The twins walked side by side, heads high, steps firm, not as victims. Not anymore. They were proof that truth can stand, that strength can grow through fire. Outside, the breeze met them with quiet relief. Their father stepped alongside them, and together they crossed the courtyard, not rushed, not hesitant, deliberate, grounded, whole. "The storm is over," Derek said softly. Jada shook her head. "No," she said, eyes forward. "We ended it." Janelle smiled, not soft, but fierce. "And we'll end it again," she said, "whenever it comes." Together they stepped through the doors of the school, not returning to who they had been, but becoming everything they were meant to be.